Hello, 10 o'clock. Good to see you. We began a series in 2014 called The Art of Living. We will be taking this sucker all the way to 2021. You should have cheered a little louder for that. Thank you. Just kidding. We're going to wrap this series up together next week, but I've loved this series. I don't know about you, but there's something about the book of Proverbs that is just so powerful. Thank you. That's why I love 10 o'clock. You fight through the rain and the crowds. Do you know how big your mansion in heaven's going to be because you're here today? The 11:30 crowd. You know how small they're... Anyway, sorry. Bad jokes. But this book of Proverbs, if you've been following along, we began in the first week of this series just texting or communicating a proverb a day. And it's 31 chapters, and just taking a proverb a day is just something for the soul. What I love about this guy named Solomon, who's written this book down some 2,700 years ago, he's practical. It's not like, a lot of the scriptures, when you read it, it's can be ethereal, and it can seem like in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word, what is going on? But Proverbs, this guy Solomon, he just, gets straight to the point. And some of them are kind of funny as you read them. But he's practical. He wants to talk about relationships. He wants to talk about how you run your business. He wants to talk about how you raise your kids. He just gets to the heart of the issue. And the book of Proverbs is just a great place to start. And he's talking about how we can increase in the skill of the art of living. And you notice as you read through the Proverbs, this guy Solomon, he just has some themes, doesn't he? He talks about some things over and over again, relationships. And as you read through the Proverbs, you cannot talk about the Proverbs, the art of living, without this topic, because it's just one of Solomon's favorite themes over and over again, the topic of money, the topic of our resources, our bank accounts. For Solomon, again and again, this is a topic that just surfaces, and there's very clear parameters around what wise people do and what it looks like to be on the path of the wise in terms of money. So that's a topic we're going to explore together today. Now, if something in you, right when I said that, sort of clenches up, and you kind of push back from the table, and there's something in you that's like, I wonder if we can make it to another service, honey, if we, at another church, if we leave now, all the online guests, just close the laptop, right when I said, stay with us. My mom's watching right now, especially you, Mom. There's something about this topic that just causes us to push back, and we don't like talking about it. But it's just something for the scriptures. And you cannot, if you take the Bible seriously, if you take Jesus seriously, it's not just Solomon, it's Jesus over and over again. The topic of money is the favorite topic of the scriptures. They want to talk about it again and again because money, more than anything else, this is why it's in the Bible. This is why you see Jesus talk about money more than he talks about anything else. For Solomon, because the topic of money is the best indicator of where your heart currently is. It's just the best, where your money flows, the direction that it goes is the best indicator of where your heart, what God is ultimately concerned with. It's just a great indicator, the best indicator of where your heart is. And so you see it as a theme that just sort of pops up again and again in the scriptures. And when we want to, try to figure out if somebody's a spiritual person in 2019, we want to talk about two things generally. We want to talk about beliefs. What does somebody believe? Heaven, hell, sort of the big topics. And behavior. What's their moral code of life? That's kind of how we determine. That's the litmus test. Or is somebody a spiritual person? The Bible essentially teaches that those things are all fine and good. Beliefs and behavior are very, very important. But it is our bank account, it is our how we spend money that is the litmus test of our spirituality in terms of where our heart ultimately is. And so if you have a Bible, one of the things you notice as you read Proverbs, there's sort of a scatter approach that Solomon takes. His teachings on money and resources is just sort of all throughout the book. You can't really get through a chapter without bumping into something about money, so we are going to explore this together today. If you have a Bible, you can turn with me to Proverbs chapter 10 is where we are going to begin. Proverbs chapter 10, security, lock the doors. That was a joke, not necessarily funny. But thank you for the four of you who laughed. Proverbs chapter 10. Now, what Solomon teaches about money, this applies whether you are your average man or whether you are Manny Machado. Doesn't matter how much money you have. Which, can we just take a moment and thank God for Manny Machado coming to the Padres? Is that not good news right there? $300 million, but we got him. It's nice. Meanwhile, you could buy Qualcomm for $3,000 if anybody's interested. Next year, Nate is taking a team to Qualcomm to rebuild it. It's going to be great. So terrible. Okay, Proverbs chapter 10. This is Solomon. He's talking about no matter how much money you have, $10, $1 million, there's clear indicators of how wise people handle their resources. It says this, and we're going to look at several verses. They all seem kind of odd on the surface, and we're going to spend some time walking through these. Verse 16 of Proverbs 10, the wages of the righteous, the resources of the righteous, or the wise person. When it comes to money often, Solomon essentially sees money as a communal issue. It affects the community. And so because of that, he talks about the righteous and the wicked, but it's the same kind of language as the wise and the fool. But he says this, the wages of the righteous, the money of the righteous is life, but the earnings of the wicked are sin and death. Now it's kind of an odd verse. The wages of the righteous is life, but the earnings of the wicked, it's sin and death. What is that about? The Bible essentially teaches, this is true for all 66 books, that money itself is morally neutral. It's not good or bad. The problem is money never exists in the hands of a morally neutral person. We're either on the path of the wise or we're on the path of the fool. And the moment that money greases the palm, the moment it hits somebody's hand, it ceases to be morally neutral. And it's now, according to Solomon, it's now a life or death issue. It's going to bring life or it's going to bring death. But money itself, it's morally neutral, but once it hits our hands, it ceases to be morally neutral depending on what we do with it. This is true for all of us, whether you are a Christian or not, whether you've ever been to church before or not. The moment money flows in, the moment you receive income, $10, $1 million, whatever it is, there's only 4 things that money can do. The moment money comes in and hits the pneumatic tube of your life, you remember the pneumatic tube at the banks in the 80s? I don't know if any banks still have this. But it just sort of, it was awesome. When I was a kid, they would always send a sucker back if I was in the car. That was the best. I wish God worked that way, it'd be great. You tithe, you get a sucker, it'd be great. But when money flows into, it hits a pneumatic tube automatically. And it can only go in one of 4 directions. There's only 4 places that it can go. The first place, this is true whether you're Christian or not, this is just, money's morally neutral. But it matters a lot to Solomon where it flows. The first place it can go is into this bucket, towards your lifestyle. It's not good or bad, it's just reality. The bills that get paid, your insurance, the car that you have, the food you eat, the clothes you wear. Money flows in, it hits this bucket. There's another place that money can go, and it's towards debt. If you're like most Americans, this is sort of a hard bucket to carry. But this is Visa. This is MasterCard. You don't need a long explanation on debt. We will solve our attendance issues at 10 o'clock real quick if we start talking about this. So we clear some seats out. Talk about debt for a while. The other place that money can go, you can give it away. It's a place that money can flow. Welcome to church. Charity, nonprofits, money can flow. For a generous person, money flows in this direction. You can give money away. That's one of the places it can go. There's another place that money can flow. You can save it. 401k, Roth IRA, HGTV, whatever. All those various places you can store money away, but it can only do one of those 4 things. Now, this is essentially the theme throughout the entire Bible, and certainly this is true for Solomon. Now, it's a principle. It's generally true. This is how it works. It certainly changes. There's seasons of life. Income goes up, income goes down. There's seasons of life, stock market goes up, goes down, the business you sold, you didn't get as much for as you thought. But in general, this is a principle that is true. If you kind of cut to the heart of what Solomon's going to teach on the topic of money, it's essentially this. For wise people, for people who are on the path of the wise in terms of money and resources, these buckets get heavier and heavier. It's a principle. In general, it's true. For wise people, these buckets get heavier and heavier. In general, it's a principle. Certainly there are seasons, those couple of years, your health wasn't cooperating, your income went down, you had to take out more loans than you thought, school was more expensive. Certainly it's seasonal, but in general it's a principle that's true. For people that are on the path of the fool, in terms of resources, in terms of money, this is what Solomon teaches throughout the book, these buckets just get heavier and heavier. Typically by default, not by design. It says, Dave Ramsey says, you either tell your money where to go or you always kind of wonder where it went. Anybody else with me on that? And by default, for someone, I'm not saying, it doesn't mean you're a fool, but if you are foolish in terms of your money, these buckets, by default, you're always kind of wondering, how did that get so heavy? Solomon, now he says something quite interesting here, and you see this sort of this theme again and again. He says the wages of the righteous, the money of the righteous person, the wise person, is life. It brings life. That a wise person has allocated resources towards bringing life where they go. And what he's talking about is a wise person is a generous person. And they have figured out, or they've decided somewhere along the way, it's not necessarily just about being a generous person or how much money do you give or how much money did you give towards a charity or towards a church, but because you value your neighbor, because you value your neighborhood, because you value being a good neighbor to your city, a wise person has allocated money that brings life where it goes. Essentially, here's Solomon's point. If you're a righteous person, this is the litmus test. If you're a wise person, when you make money, it's not just good news for you, it's good news for the community. It's good news for your employees. When profits go up, it's good news for your customers. It's good news for your church. It's good news for your community. Someone who's wise, when money flows in, they're like an economic engine that bring blessing and life. Life just kind of flourishes around them. You know people like this. There's flourishing around them because the way in which they handle money, Solomon says, it brings life wherever they go. Bruce Waltke, one of my favorite commentators on the book of Proverbs, he says it this way in talking about this verse or this concept of the righteous and the wicked in terms of money. He says, the righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. A righteous person, a wise person, again, it's not do you give money or do you not? That's not his point. His point is, do you care about your fellow man? And a wise person sees money as a tool in his or her hand that God has entrusted to them to benefit and bless the community and the city. He says the righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. So why would I buy this when I could use the money for this? I could bless people with this, or I'm going to disadvantage myself to advantage others. The wicked, essentially, his point is they're like a cul-de-sac. They're willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. The money flows in, and it goes just towards, they're like a cul-de-sac for a foolish person, for the wicked person. It's just, well, aren't I lucky? It just kind of hangs out in the cul-de-sac. For a wise person, the money that flows in begins to bring life. They don't just think about how they can make more money. They think about how can I bring life with the money that God has entrusted to me for this season. The question he's essentially asking, when you make money, is it good news for anybody other than you? That's his question. If you got a raise last year, was that good news for someone other than you? For a wise person, they're willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage other people. Now, every single one of us in this room would say, whether we are or not, being a generous person is important. You should do that. And yet we would all have theories and we would all have reasons why in American culture or why in culture in general, being generous is difficult. And Solomon is going to give us a very clear reason, which is really the heart of his teaching, and why this isn't what we're talking about today. It's really not about money at all. It's always about something else, isn't it? It's about something bigger than that. And for Solomon, he's going to tell us what cuts to the issue of what money is really all about. He says this in Proverbs chapter 18. This is kind of you hear that, you go, well, man, being generous is important. Solomon says the reason that's always going to be difficult is because of this. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 10 and 11. He says this, the name of the Lord is a fortified, strong tower, essentially. The righteous, again, the wise, run into it and they are safe. But notice what he does. He positions not the righteous and the wicked. He says it's the rich and the righteous. The wealth of the rich, which in the writer's mind, this would be every single one of us in this room. If you have a car in the driveway today, you would be in this category, even if you don't place yourself in this category, of being a wealthy, a rich person. The wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale. The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. The wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale. So he's putting his finger on the problem of why it's so hard to be one of these generous people who bring human flourishing in life wherever you go. And now it sounds kind of odd on the surface, but the little translation, I think it's kind of easy to understand. In our culture, in our world, 2019, you can live in the suburbs, you can live in an urban setting, you can live in the country. It's all just kind of a matter of preference. Where do you want to live? In ancient societies, 2,700 years ago, or 2,000 years, this certainly was not the case. You needed to live in a city. A city was more than just a preference. Cities, Jerusalem's a good example of this. They were fortified. They had a massive gate that was around it, still there to this very day in Jerusalem. And inside of the city, there was an economy. There was a caste system. You knew where you belonged in the city. If you committed a crime, you could be punished for that inside of the city. Outside of the city, it was lawless and wild. There were warring tribes. Outside of the city, if somebody committed a crime against you, if somebody killed a friend of yours, there was no punishment for that. There was no sense of government. There was no way to earn a living outside of the city. There was no sense of identity. It didn't matter if you were royal, king, queen. If you were killed outside of the city, it was sort of on you because you had braved the wilderness of being outside of the city. And so being in the city, economy, where you ranked in society, you knew you were safe. So when you entered into the city gate in an ancient civilization, Jerusalem would be a good example of this, but not just Jerusalem, any ancient city, when you walked through the city gate, there was a sense of, I'm safe. Essentially, what a city offered you was two things primarily. It offered you a sense of identity. You knew where you belonged in civilization. And it also offered you a sense of safety. You knew to the best of human civilization's ability, you were safe inside of the city. Outside of the city, you didn't know who you were. You certainly were not safe. Inside of the city, I have identity and I have a sense of security. Now, why Solomon says this is because for 66 books of the Bible, if you're new to church, this is kind of an overview of what the Bible is all about. It's 66 books of God telling you two things that meet your most primal needs as a human being. The first is your identity. For 66 books, God is telling you what your identity is, that you are bought with a price, the blood of Jesus. You are given a new name in the presence of Jesus. You are the loved sons and daughters of a perfect Father, that your sins are not who you are. You are not what you've done in Jesus. You are a child of God. You belong at the banquet table of God. It doesn't matter what family you've been born into. It doesn't matter what your worst sin is. It doesn't matter what your worst sin will ever be. Nothing can ever change the identity and the name that God has given you. The most primal need you have as a human being, your identity has been written in stone because of what Jesus Christ has done. Your most basic human need of identity has been met in the scripture. 66 books trying to articulate that to you. The other most basic human need of security, you see this in the scriptures. It's 66 books of God trying to tell you this basic primal need that you have for a sense of safety, a sense of, Am I okay? God has met this need, that you are safe, you are secure. Not only is your identity fixed, but you are safe. You are at the banquet table of God. Not even death itself can rip you apart from what God has given to you, a sense of eternal security in the presence of Christ. It's been given to you, your identity and your security. You have a fortified city. The name of the Lord is your fortified city. What's so intoxicating about money is that it's the only thing that exists in the world that promises and seduces to meet those two needs that we have. It promises you a sense of identity, and what's so intoxicating, the reason Jesus talks about it more than he talks about anything else, the reason Jesus is constantly exploring this topic, the reason why Jesus talks about it is because the greatest rival for your heart, the greatest rival for your affection today is not the devil, it's money. Money is the only thing that promises you a sense of identity and a sense of security. It's not your fault, it's not my fault, but every single one of us in this room, every single one of us in this world, we are fundamentally insecure creatures. Life is like a perpetual loop of 7th grade. We're just a little bit older, isn't it? We're insecure. We want to know we belong. We want to know that we matter. And the fastest way that you can feel a sense of identity is to begin to have money. The moment you have money, you don't just have something, you now feel like you are something. We begin to rank ourselves against other people. I don't just have more than them, I am more than them. They don't just have more than me, they are more than me. This is the entire allure of social media, by the way. We begin to rank ourselves against other people. It gives us a sense of identity. Money gives us a sense of security. It seduces us to make us think that we're safe if we have it. And the scriptures certainly teach we should save, that there's a benefit to that. But when it seduces us to make us think that we're secure, that it's our fortified city. Here's the reality. Every single one of us, if we thought about it, we would know that's ridiculous. You are on a ball of dirt right now that is flinging around a ball of heat called the sun. Nothing is secure. You know this from health. You know this from the news. Life is fragile and hangs by a thread. And yet money is something that we will turn to and go, if I have it, I'm safe, I'm secure. It seduces, it invites us, it gives us a false sense of identity, and it gives us a false sense of security. Solomon's saying it becomes our fortified city. And the problem is, if it is, God by default is now just a moral code for you or some kind of eternal ticket to get somewhere when you die. And he wants God to become, this is the whole theme of the scriptures, your identity and your security. And if money is the place where your identity and your security comes from, a preacher, a nonprofit, whatever it is, can ask for money, and it'll always feel like they're asking for more than money. You won't be free to be generous, because to give your money away, to let go of it, it'll be emotional, because it will feel like somebody's asking for a part of your identity and a part of your security. You've had those interactions, those conversations. Maybe it's with a friend when the bill comes, and everybody gets kind of weird when we start talking about money because we're not. In those moments often it feels like this is about something more than money. And Solomon says it is. It's about your fortified city. It's about where your identity and it's about where your security comes from. And if it's in money, you will never be free to be a wise and a generous person. But if your identity begins to shift towards God, he becomes your fortified city. He becomes the tower that you run into. And you know that you actually have security and an identity that comes from God. People who live that way begin to say, you'll hear people say, it's just money. Because it is. It's not an identity. It's not a sense of security. And you will be free to be a generous person. It's not about how much you have or how little you have. It's about where does your identity and where does your security come from? And if it's in God, his voice is spoken over you and you've received it, you're now free to be a wise and a generous person, as Solomon invites us to be. You're now free to disadvantage yourself to advantage somebody else. So the scriptures invite us into that. You see it again and again in the Proverbs. And then he's going to teach a principle. And this is, he's on the same page as all the other books of the Bible. But he teaches us this principle of how people whose identity and security comes from God, not from money, how they begin to live or how they're free to live. And the Bible actually uses this over and over again. The New Testament, it's an agricultural metaphor for how we think about money. Here's essentially what here's what Solomon teaches, and essentially all the Bible teaches this. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 24. He says this, one person, he's talking about a wise person. You see these two roads again, the wise, the fool. One person gives freely, they're free to give, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, foolish person, and they will come to poverty. Verse 25, a generous person will prosper, yet whoever refreshes others will be refreshed, according to Solomon. You see this again and again. It's just a principle. It's in the scriptures. It's just a principle. The Bible teaches over and over again. One person gives freely, it gains even more. Another withholds unduly, comes to poverty. A generous person, which for Solomon is someone God is their fortified tower. A generous person will prosper, and whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. You see this all throughout the scriptures, that God has a golden rule. It's a principle. It's all throughout the scriptures. And you probably were taught somewhere along the way the golden rule. Treat others the way that you want to be treated. You taught at least your kids. You make them do that. But that golden rule that you learned in school, it's a helpful thing to live by. The scriptures essentially teach that God lives according to his own golden rule. And God's golden rule is essentially this: I will treat you how you treat other people. That's God's golden rule. You see this in the New Testament. Forgive others, I will forgive you. Judge others harshly, you will be judged harshly. And the same is true in terms of generosity. If you take care of the people that God cares about, those that are made in the image of God, if you are generous towards others, God says, here's the deal: I will be generous towards you. It's a principle. Agricultural metaphor cuts throughout all the 66 books of the Bible. The principle is essentially this: the more you give, the more open-handed you are, the more you will have. Many of us in this room, you could stand up and tell that story. And yet at the same time, on the other side of the coin, the more you hoard and clench and hold on to it, the less you will have. Just 66 books over and over again. Solomon, this is how he words that specific principle. It's an agricultural principle. You think of it as a farmer that has some seed. The more you give, the more you plant the seed, the more crops, the more fruit is produced. On the other side of the coin, the more you hoard the seed, the more you hold on to it. The Bible talks about money as if it's a seed that gets planted or doesn't get planted. The more you hold on to it, the less crops you have, the less crops are produced. Now, the tendency when we read that, we think, well, great, the more I give, the more I'll have. I'll kind of put that to the test. And, in 2 months, if I give a lot of money away, I'll have a Ferrari and a fountain in the bedroom. And, it'll be... That's not what the Bible teaches. Okay, here's what the Bible teaches. God will take care of you as his child. He will make sure that you have what you need. He will sustain you. He's your sustainer. But it's an agricultural principle. You think of it in terms of a seed. When you plant a seed in the ground, you would be very disappointed if that just produced more seed. If you came out and you're like, sweet, another seed tree, that would be disappointing. There's a conversion rate beneath the soil, isn't there? You plant the seed, and God, through the miracle of sunlight and rain, is able to produce strawberries or whatever the crop is. There's the miracle that takes place. And the same is true in terms of money. There's a conversion rate that when you plant the seed, when you give the money, you now begin to see that God is producing and doing something through the money that he's entrusted to you, that you have planted into the ground, and has produced something beautiful. People often ask, I go to lunch with people in our church often, and they'll say, kind of get to the end of the lunch and say, well, I have a question. What does CRB do with the money that it takes in? And the simple answer to that is that the church, not just our church, but the Church of Jesus Christ, when we are firing on all cylinders, doing what God has asked us to do, the church is in the business of turning money into beautiful stories. And that's it. That's what the church is in the business of doing. that when you give generously to our church, that what you essentially are doing is you're creating an opportunity for what we saw last week, people to be baptized on the other side of this wall, kids to be taught about Jesus Christ and where their fortified tower is, homes to be built in Mexico, survivors of human trafficking being rescued from that lifestyle, over and over again when the Church of Jesus Christ is firing on all cylinders. And the beautiful thing is when you have contributed to that and you see somebody baptized or you see a home built, there is something in you that going, that's part of the seed that I planted. My name's on that story. The church, the conversion rate is money to beautiful stories. That's the business that the church is supposed to be in the business that I hope we are always in as a local body of faith. The first question that Solomon essentially asks on this topic of money is not, hey, are you going to start giving it away? The first question he asks is essentially this: where does your identity and your security come from? Is it in God? And this is so hard. It's such a difficult thing. Roseanne and I, when we give to this church, when we give generously, there is something in us every single time that when you do that, you're praying for God's reign and for His justice and for His beauty to fall on it so that it produces something beautiful. But every single time it is an act of trust. And He has to be your fortified city. That's the first question. Is God your fortified city that you run to? Or is it money? And if you would say today, I'm on the path of God becoming my fortified city, my fortified tower. I'm starting to turn to Him. He's my identity. He's becoming more and more every day my security. You're now free, according to Solomon, to be a generous person. You're now free to view money as a seed that's going to be planted to produce something more beautiful that outlives you and outlives me. If you hear that and you go, that sounds nice, and I'm a Christian, and I know, Jesus loves me, I know the song, I could sing it, Jared, if you want me to stand up and sing it right now, I could sing the song, I'm that much of a Christian. If you hear that, but there's something in you on this topic of money that just kind of freezes up and you feel kind of guilty as you kind of start talking. This isn't a guilt thing, but what I want to do is just give you some practical tools to becoming a generous person. And the reason why this sounds so intimidating and it sounds so lofty, and oftentimes when somebody says, hey, you should be generous, it sounds like, hey, you should lose 200 pounds by next Thursday. It's just like, how in the world do I do that? Here's the reason why it feels that way. Because chances are pretty good, if you grew up in church, you have any kind of background in church, somewhere along the way, you heard about the tithe. And the tithe is a biblical concept, it's taught in the Old Testament over and over again, of 10% of your income, God says, I want you to set aside for the local community of faith. And for most of us, when you hear that, you started coming to church a few years ago, especially in a church like ours, you started coming to church in the last 5 years, last 10 years, you got back in church for the first time in the last 5 years, you hear that and you go, I can't do, that sounds nice, but Visa would never let me do that. It just sounds so big. Here's what I would encourage you to do. Don't start there. God always meets people. This is another theme, principle throughout the scriptures. God meets people where they are, and He invites them to take the next step. And so if you're somebody like most people, and this isn't a guilt thing, we're not going to read a list of names or bring a big thermometer on stage, and we're not doing that today. But if you're like most people and currently where you are, you would say, you know what, I've never given anything. I'm just not a generous person. Generosity is someone else's problem. If that's you, I would just invite you to take the next step and become a person who starts to give something. You decide what it is. It could be $5, it could be $20, whatever, you decide. But what you're doing in that moment, and you do that for a little while. See, you have something inside of you called the Spirit of God that's active and alive. You are a temple and a house of God, and God has chosen to take up residence inside of you when you step into the presence of Jesus. And so as the Spirit of God is active and alive inside of you, He starts to prompt you on the kind of life that He wants you to live. And you and I, we just have to listen. And as He prompts you, as you start becoming a generous person, or you start giving a little bit of something, you start taking a little bit of that seed, and you start being generous with it, all of a sudden in time, what happens is God says, I want you to take the next step. So you begin there, and then in time, you take the next step. And it's not to, jump all the way up to the top of the ladder. It's to become a person that would begin to give a percentage of your income. Because when you start doing that, it could be 2%, it could be 4%. Don't start here. Allow God to meet you where you are and say, okay, I'm going to take the next step. And in time, it might take you 2 years, it might take you 3 years, who knows? But you become a generous person, and now when it starts to become a percentage, 2%, 7%, now when you're doing that, it's starting to affect how you're thinking about purchases, isn't it? It's starting to really test this idea of where your identity and where your security comes from. And in time, as you start to do that, you become a tither. You start giving 10%. When you start doing that, this is seriously going to impact when you do the kitchen renovation, when you buy, what car you buy. It's all of a sudden going to, but what you're doing in the process is you're saying, God, my identity and my security is not in money, it's in you. I want to be a generous person. I want to be a generous person. And in time, you do that for a while. That's the Old Testament standard. But in time, and this may take you 10 years to do, but you become a person of extravagant giving. We have a lot of people in this church that have pulled me aside and they have said, listen, years ago, my wife and I, we were 10%ers for a long time, and God invited us to be extravagant givers, because when you read the New Testament, it's sacrificial. Listen, Jesus Christ did not tithe his life. He didn't put 10% of himself on the cross. All of who he is, and we are invited to be extravagant people. But the first and the most primary question that he asks, where's your identity? Where's your security? We're going to take the elements of communion together this morning. And the reason we do is because the blood of Jesus and the body of Jesus has sealed your identity and your security. It's not about money. It's about, do you hear the voice of God in your life and in your heart, inviting you to be safe and secure through his sacrifice on the cross? Through the blood of Christ alone, we have a new name and we have security. If you can't stand for some particular reason, just wave your hand. Our ushers will bring the elements of communion to you. DJ and the band are going to lead us. But as we do, would you reflect on this question of what is your fortified tower? Is it God or is it something else? Come to the table today from the left side of your aisle and reflect on how Christ more and more can be the strong tower that you run to. Let's take the elements of communion together. God bless you as you come.